The October afternoon sun filtered through the gauze curtains of the Henderson family home in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina, casting soft golden rectangles across the hardwood floors. Sarah Henderson stood in her kitchen, her 7-month pregnant belly pressing against the marble countertop as she arranged pink and blue macarons on a 3-tiered serving stand. The house buzzed with the gentle chaos of preparation, her sister Emma hanging streamers in the living room, while their mother, Patricia, fussed over the flower arrangements. "Sarah, honey, these centerpieces look absolutely gorgeous," Patricia called out, adjusting a cluster of white peonies. At 62, she still moved with the purposeful energy of someone who had spent 30 years organizing church functions and community events. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and she wore the same soft pink cardigan she'd chosen specifically to match the baby shower's color scheme. Sarah smiled, though something tight in her chest wouldn't quite release. This should have been the happiest day of her pregnancy, surrounded by family and friends, celebrating the impending arrival of her first child with her husband Michael. But there was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't shake, a feeling that had been growing stronger over the past few weeks. "Mum, have you heard from Uncle Robert?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "He said he'd be here by 2, and it's already 2:30. Patricia's hands stilled on the flowers for just a moment, so brief that Sarah almost missed it. "Oh, you know your uncle. He's probably just running late from the office. You know how demanding his law practice can be." But Sarah did notice, and she noticed too how her mother's eyes didn't quite meet hers when she said it. Robert Henderson had been acting strangely for months now. Her father's younger brother had always been the reliable one, the steady presence at every family gathering, the uncle who never missed a birthday or holiday. Lately, though, he seemed distracted, almost haunted. At her cousin Danny's wedding just 2 months ago, Robert had barely spoken to anyone, spending most of the reception standing alone on the venue's terrace, staring out at the lake with an expression Sarah couldn't decipher. The doorbell rang, and Emma's voice carried from the foyer. "I'll get it. That's probably Mrs. Chen with the cake." Sarah heard the familiar sounds of arrival, greetings, compliments on the decorations, the rustle of gift bags, and the soft click of heels on hardwood. Soon the house would be full of the women who had shaped her life, her college friends, neighbors, co-workers from the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade, Michael's mother and sister. It should have felt perfect. Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, his tall frame filling the space as he loosened his tie. His dark hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it, a habit he'd developed whenever he was stressed about work. At 34, he still had the easy smile that had first caught Sarah's attention when they'd met at a friend's barbecue 5 years ago, but lately, even his smiles seemed to carry weight. "How's my beautiful wife?" he asked, crossing to her and placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "And how's our little troublemaker?" He leaned down to kiss her belly, a gesture that usually made Sarah laugh. Today, it made her want to cry, though she couldn't say why. "We're both fine," she said, leaning into his warmth. "Just a little tired. Did you finish everything at the office?" Michael nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Yeah, finally got that Henderson Industries contract review done. Your Uncle Robert sure knows how to keep things complicated." There it was again, that strange note in his voice when he mentioned Robert. Sarah pulled back to look at her husband's face. "What do you mean?" "Nothing specific," Michael said quickly, but his eyes shifted away from hers. "Just some unusual clauses in the partnership agreements. Probably nothing important." The front door opened again, and this time Sarah heard the deep rumble of male voices mixing with the feminine chatter. Her heart rate quickened. Michael was supposed to disappear upstairs with the other husbands and fathers who had been conscripted into gift-carrying duty before making themselves scarce. This was meant to be a traditional women-only celebration. Sarah, her best friend from college, Jennifer, appeared in the kitchen doorway, radiant in a flowing yellow dress that complemented her auburn hair. Behind her came a stream of familiar faces: Lisa from the teacher's lounge, her neighbor Carol, Michael's sister Amanda, with her twin daughters in tow. The house filled quickly. Sarah found herself swept into the living room, settling into the chair they designated as the throne, a wingback armchair decorated with ribbons and positioned to give her the best view of the gift-opening festivities. The coffee table groaned under the weight of perfectly wrapped packages in soft pastels, each adorned with elaborate bows and tiny cards written in careful cursive. Patricia moved through the gathering with practiced grace, ensuring everyone had punch and finger sandwiches, orchestrating the flow of conversation with the skill of someone who had hosted countless such events. But Sarah noticed how her mother's eyes kept drifting toward the front windows and how she startled slightly every time a car door slammed outside. "So, have you two settled on names yet?" asked Lisa, settling onto the sofa with a plate of petit fours. "I know you're keeping the gender a surprise, but surely you have some favorites picked out." Sarah placed a protective hand over her belly. "We have a few contenders, but nothing final yet. Michael wants to wait until we meet the baby to decide." She smiled, but it felt forced. The truth was, they'd been having the same circular conversations about names for weeks, unable to agree on anything. It seemed like such a small thing, but it felt symbolic of something larger, a sense that they weren't quite aligned on this monumental change approaching their lives. The conversation flowed around her, discussions of nursery themes, recommendations for pediatricians, horror stories and reassurances about labor and delivery. Sarah participated when appropriate, laughed at the right moments, exclaimed over each gift as she unwrapped it, but part of her attention remained fixed on the front door, waiting. At 3:15, just as Patricia was preparing to serve the cake, Robert finally arrived. Sarah heard his voice in the foyer before she saw him, that familiar baritone that had read her bedtime stories when she was small, that had given the toast at her wedding, that had always been associated with safety and stability in her mind. But today, something in its tone made her stomach clench. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," Robert called out as he entered the living room. "Got held up at the office." Robert Henderson was 57 years old, with the kind of distinguished silver at his temples that made him look like a successful attorney should look. He kept himself in good shape with morning runs and weekend tennis, and he typically carried himself with quiet confidence. Today, though, he looked haggard. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. More unsettling was the manila envelope he carried in his left hand, gripped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. "Uncle Robert!" Sarah started to rise from her chair, but he waved her back down. "Don't get up, sweetheart. This is your day." His smile was strained, and when he leaned down to kiss her cheek, she caught the faint scent of whiskey on his breath. Her uncle wasn't a heavy drinker, a glass of wine with dinner, maybe a beer while watching football. The fact that he'd been drinking in the middle of the afternoon sent alarm bells ringing in her head. "Can I get you some punch, Robert?" Patricia's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the sharp look she gave her brother-in-law. "Or maybe some coffee?" "No, thank you, Patricia. I'm fine." Robert remained standing while the other guests settled back into their conversations. He looked around the room, his gaze touching each face with an odd intensity. Sarah's friends and family members began to sense the shift in atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter, and several people glanced uncertainly between Robert and the door, as if sensing that the comfortable social ritual had somehow gone off course. Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, probably coming to check on the celebration's progress before retreating back to whatever sports game was playing in the upstairs den. When he saw Robert, he froze mid-step. "Robert," Michael said carefully, his voice carrying down the staircase. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I bet you weren't," Robert replied, and there was something sharp in his tone that made Sarah's breath catch. The room had gone almost completely quiet now. Patricia set down the cake server with hands that Sarah noticed were trembling slightly. Emma, who had been photographing the gift opening, slowly lowered her camera. Even the twin girls stopped their whispered conversation and looked toward the adults with the intuitive awareness children have when something important is happening. Robert stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by pink and blue decorations, holding that manila envelope like it contained either salvation or damnation. The October sunlight had shifted, and shadows were beginning to stretch across the floor. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, and someone's lawn mower hummed. Steadily, ordinary sounds of a suburban Saturday afternoon that seemed to belong to a different world from the tension building inside the Henderson home. "Well," Robert said finally, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He looked around the baby shower one more time, at the carefully arranged flowers, the stack of presents, the expectant faces of the women who had come to celebrate new life and family bonds. His eyes lingered longest on Sarah, sitting in her ribbon-decorated chair with her hands protectively covering her unborn child. "Since we're all here," Sarah felt her heart start to pound against her ribs. Whatever was coming, whatever Robert was about to say, she suddenly knew with absolute certainty that it would change everything. The baby kicked hard against her palm, as if sensing the shift in the world outside the womb, and Sarah had the wild thought that maybe this was what her child would remember as their first family memory, not joy and celebration, but the moment when secrets rose to the surface like bodies in a flood. Robert's grip tightened on the envelope, and Sarah saw his jaw clench with resolve. The silence stretched taut as a violin string, and in that suspended moment before everything changed, Sarah found herself cataloguing the scene with desperate intensity. Her mother's pale face, Michael's rigid posture on the stairs, Jennifer's confused expression, the way the afternoon light made the streamers glow like stained glass. This was the last moment of the before times, and somehow she knew it. Robert Henderson looked around the room one final time, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the manila envelope that had been burning a hole in his conscience for 3 weeks. 23 years of carefully constructed lies were about to crumble in the space of a single sentence. "I'm Sarah's biological father." The words dropped into the baby shower like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in concentric circles of shock. For a moment, the only sound was the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant hum of suburban life continuing unchanged outside. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face so completely that she wondered if she might faint. Her hands instinctively pressed harder against her belly, as if protecting her unborn child from the seismic shift happening in their family's foundation. "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Patricia Henderson made a sound like a wounded animal, a sharp intake of breath followed by a sob that she quickly smothered with her hand. She sank into the nearest chair, her carefully styled silver hair falling across her face as she bent forward, her whole body curling in on itself as if she could physically contain the devastation spreading through the room. "Mom?" Emma's camera slipped from her fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the room frozen. Several of Sarah's friends began to murmur uncertainly, looking toward the door as if suddenly realizing they were witnessing something far too private and painful for outsiders. Michael came down the stairs 3 at a time, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with you, Robert? This is supposed to be a celebration of new life?" Robert's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Yes, I'm aware, but I can't carry this anymore, Michael. I've been carrying it for 23 years, and I can't—" His voice broke, and he pressed his free hand against his forehead. "I can't watch her start her own family built on the same lies that built ours." Sarah struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making the movement awkward and slow. The room seemed to tilt around her, and she had to grip the arm of the chair to steady herself. "Uncle Robert, what are you talking about? This can't be—" But even as she said it, pieces were clicking into place with horrible clarity. Robert's inexplicable devotion to her throughout her childhood, the way he'd never missed a school play or soccer game, even when her own father had been too busy with work, the college fund that had appeared mysteriously when her parents said they couldn't afford to send her to her first-choice school. Robert's fierce protectiveness whenever she'd had problems with boyfriends, a protectiveness that had always seemed to go beyond normal uncle concern, and her father, the man she'd called Dad her entire life, how he'd sometimes seemed like he was trying too hard, loving her with an intensity that felt almost desperate, as if he were afraid she might slip away from him. "Patricia," Robert said, his voice gentle but implacable, "tell her. She deserves to know the truth." Patricia looked up, her face streaked with tears and aged by decades in the span of minutes. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that everyone in the room had to strain to hear her. "It was 1999. Your father, David, was traveling so much for work. He was gone 3 weeks out of every month trying to build up the business, and Robert had just gone through his divorce, and he was so lonely, and I was so lonely, and one night we just—" She shook her head, unable to continue. The baby shower guests were beginning to file out quietly, recognizing that they were witnessing the implosion of a family and having the grace to remove themselves from something so intimate and devastating. Jennifer squeezed Sarah's shoulder as she passed, whispering, "Call me later, okay?" But Sarah barely registered the exodus. Her entire world had narrowed to the 3 people who had shaped her understanding of who she was, and the terrible truth that was rewriting her history with every word. "It was one night," Patricia continued, her voice barely audible. "Just one night, and we both regretted it immediately. We agreed never to speak of it, never to let it happen again. When I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks later, we assumed, we hoped." She looked directly at Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "David was so happy. He'd been wanting a baby for so long, and the timing could have worked either way, so we let him believe." "Let him believe?" Sarah's voice was rising now, edged with hysteria. "You let him believe for 23 years that I was his daughter. You are his daughter." Patricia stood up, her own voice gaining strength. "David raised you, loved you, walked the floor with you when you had colic, taught you to ride a bicycle, scared away the boys who weren't good enough for you. Biology doesn't make a father, Sarah. Love does." But Robert was shaking his head, his face etched with years of accumulated guilt. "No, Patricia. Love also means truth. It means not building a life on deception." He turned to Sarah, and she could see her own eyes looking back at her. The same deep brown, the same slight upturn at the corners that she'd always wondered about, since both Patricia and David had blue eyes. "I tried to stay away," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "After that night, I tried to transfer to our Atlanta office, tried to put distance between us. But then you were born, and the moment I saw you—" He stopped, overcome. I knew you were mine, and I couldn't leave you. I couldn't leave my daughter, even if I could never claim you as mine." Sarah felt her knees buckle, and Michael was suddenly there, his arm around her waist, supporting her weight. She looked at her husband, the man who had thought he was marrying David Henderson's daughter, who was expecting David Henderson's grandchild, and saw her own shock and confusion reflected in his face. "Where is he?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Oh, where's Dad? Does he know?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Patricia's face crumpled. "He found out 3 weeks ago. I don't know how. Robert thinks maybe the private investigator from his recent insurance investigation might have run some kind of background check that flagged inconsistencies. Or maybe David had his own suspicions and decided to get a DNA test." "A DNA test?" Sarah's voice was hollow. "Dad got a DNA test?" Robert held up the manila envelope he'd been clutching. "He confronted me at my office. He had the results. 23 years of believing you were his daughter, and then a piece of paper told him the truth in black and white." Robert's voice cracked. "He gave me these copies and told me I had 2 weeks to figure out how to tell you, or he would. And then what? Where is he now?" He's staying at the Marriott downtown, Patricia whispered. He packed a bag and left the day after he confronted Robert. He said he needed time to think, to figure out what this meant for our family. Sarah stared at her mother, the woman who had lied to her for her entire life, who had let her grow up believing in a family structure that was built on deception. What this meant for our family. What about what it means for me? What about what it means for my baby? She gestured toward her swollen belly, and suddenly the full implications hit her like a physical blow. Oh God, my child, I don't even know who I am, and I'm about to bring a child into this world. I don't know my medical history, my genetic background, Sarah, honey, calm down. Michael's voice was steady, though she could feel the tension in his body where he supported her. This doesn't change who you are. You're still the same person you were an hour ago. But Sarah shook her head violently. No, I'm not. An hour ago, I was David Henderson's daughter. I was your wife, getting ready to have our first baby in a family that made sense. Now I'm... She looked around the room, at the baby's shower decorations that suddenly seemed to mock the chaos that had erupted beneath them. Now I don't know what I am. Robert took a step toward her, his face raw with emotion. You're my daughter. You've always been my daughter, and I've loved you every single day of your life, even when I couldn't say it out loud. Don't. Sarah held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Don't you dare. You don't get to claim me now, after 23 years of lies. You were my uncle. You were supposed to be the safe one, the reliable one, and instead, you were lying to me every single day. Sarah, Patricia started. And you, Sarah rounded on her mother. How could you do this to Dad? How could you do this to me? How could you let him love me, raise me, think I was his flesh and blood, and never tell him the truth? Patricia was crying openly now, her mascara running in dark streams down her cheeks. Because I love him, because I love you both, because telling the truth would have destroyed our family. Well, congratulations, Mom. Keeping the secret destroyed it anyway. But the room fell silent except for Patricia's quiet sobbing and the ticking of the grandfather clock. Outside, the suburban afternoon continued its peaceful pace. Children playing in yards, lawnmowers humming, dogs barking. Normal life, continuing in a world where families stayed intact and secrets stayed buried. Michael's arm tightened around Sarah's waist. We need to go, he said quietly. Sarah needs to rest, and we all need time to process this. Where will we go? Sarah asked, the question coming out more broken than she'd intended. This was my childhood home. This was supposed to be where I brought my baby for family dinners and holidays. This was supposed to be safe. It still can be, Robert said desperately. Nothing has to change. We can work through this as a family. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for traces of herself that she'd never noticed before. The shape of his nose, the set of his jaw, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was nervous. How had she never seen it? Everything has changed, she said quietly. Everything. She looked around the living room one more time, at the abandoned baby shower gifts, at the cake that would never be cut, at the family photos on the mantle that now felt like elaborate props in a play about people who didn't really exist. Her whole life had been a lie, and now she was about to become a mother herself, carrying forward a legacy of deception and broken trust. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her belly. For a moment, the room held its breath, waiting to see if something was wrong. The baby's fine, Sarah said, though her voice was shaky, just active, probably responding to my stress. Sarah, please. Patricia stood up, reaching toward her daughter. Don't let this destroy us. Don't let one mistake from 24 years ago ruin everything we've built together. But Sarah stepped back, away from her mother's outstretched hand. One mistake? Mom, this wasn't one mistake. This was 23 years of active deception. This was letting Dad believe a lie every single day for my entire life. This was letting me believe a lie about who I am. She looked at Michael, seeing her own lost confusion reflected in his face. They had built their marriage on shared values of honesty and trust, and now she was discovering that her entire family foundation was riddled with lies. What did that mean for them? What did that mean for their child? "I need to see him," Sarah said suddenly. "I need to see Dad, the man I called Dad my whole life." "Sarah, I don't think that's a good idea right now," Patricia said quickly. "He's very hurt and angry. Maybe in a few days, when everyone has had time to—" "He's had 3 weeks to process this," Sarah interrupted. "I've had 3 minutes. I think I deserve to hear his side of the story." She started toward the door, moving as quickly as her pregnancy would allow. Michael followed, and she was grateful for his solid presence beside her, grateful that at least one person in her life was exactly who she thought he was. At the front door, she turned back to look at Patricia and Robert, the two people who had shaped her entire understanding of family and love and truth. They looked older somehow, diminished by the weight of the secret they'd finally released. "I don't know when I'll be ready to talk to either of you again," Sarah said. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I need you both to understand something. The family we had, the family I thought we were, that's gone now. It died the moment you decided the truth was less important than your comfort." She walked out of her childhood home, leaving behind the wreckage of her baby shower and the pieces of her shattered identity. Michael helped her into their car, his hands gentle but his face grim, with the knowledge that their life together had just become infinitely more complicated. As they drove away, Sarah looked back at the house where she'd grown up, where she'd felt safe and loved and sure of her place in the world. The afternoon sun was setting earlier now that it was October, and the windows glowed warm and golden, making the house look picture-perfect from the outside. But appearances, Sarah was learning, could be the most dangerous lies of all. The Marriott Hotel in downtown Charlotte felt like a different planet from the suburban comfort Sarah had known all her life. The lobby was all gleaming marble and indirect lighting, filled with the quiet murmur of business travelers and the soft ding of elevator doors. Sarah sat in an oversized armchair near the concierge desk, her hands clasped over her belly, trying to summon the courage to call the man she'd known as her father for 23 years. Michael had driven her here after they'd spent 2 hours sitting in their own driveway, neither of them speaking, both trying to process the earthquake that had just rearranged their understanding of everything. Finally, Sarah had asked him to bring her to the hotel. She needed to see David Henderson, needed to look into the eyes of the man who had raised her and try to understand what this revelation meant for both of them. "You sure you want to do this tonight?" Michael asked, settling into the chair beside her. "It's been a hell of a day already." Sarah nodded, though her stomach was churning with nerves and morning sickness and the residual shock of learning that her entire identity was built on a foundation of lies. "I can't go home and pretend to sleep while he's sitting in a hotel room thinking his whole life was a lie." "His whole life wasn't a lie, Sarah. He loved you. He raised you. That part was real. But what if he can't see it that way? What if finding out I'm not biologically his changes how he feels about me?" Michael took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Then he's not the man I thought he was. The David Henderson I know doesn't love conditionally." But Sarah wasn't so sure. In the 3 weeks since he'd learned the truth, her father hadn't called her, hadn't tried to see her, hadn't responded to the text messages she'd sent asking if he was okay. The man who had been a constant presence in her life had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a hotel address that Patricia had provided with obvious reluctance. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "How are you holding up? The whole book club is worried about you." She stared at the message, realizing that by now, the story of what had happened at her baby shower would be spreading through her social circle like wildfire. The thought made her feel exposed and raw, as if her private pain was being dissected by people who had no right to the intimate details of her family's destruction. "I'm okay. Need some time to process. Thank you for caring." She sent the reply and then turned off her phone. "Room 847, Michael said, reading from the slip of paper Patricia had given them. "You ready for this?" The elevator ride to the 8th floor felt eternal. Sarah watched the numbers climb and tried to prepare herself for whatever version of David Henderson she was about to encounter. Would he be angry? heartbroken. Would he look at her differently now that he knew she wasn't his biological child? The hallway was carpeted in deep burgundy, muffling their footsteps as they made their way to room 847. Sarah raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. "What if he doesn't want to see me? Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Michael said gently. "But Sarah, you've been his daughter for 23 years. I can't believe that changes overnight." Sarah knocked 3 times, soft but distinct. For a moment there was no response, and she wondered if he was even in the room. Then she heard movement, the creak of bed springs, footsteps on carpet. "Who is it?" David's voice came through the door, and Sarah's heart clenched at how tired he sounded. "It's Sarah, Dad. Can I come in?" The silence stretched so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. Then she heard the chain lock slide and the deadbolt turn. David Henderson opened the door, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The man she'd known all her life looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. His usually neat brown hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless questions. But what broke her heart was the way he looked at her, with love and pain and uncertainty all warring in his expression. "Sarah." He said her name like a prayer and a question all at once. "Hi, Dad." The word hung between them, loaded with new meaning now that they both knew the truth about her paternity. David's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Sarah thought he might close the door in her face. Instead, he stepped back and gestured them inside. The hotel room was modest but comfortable, with a king-sized bed, a small sitting area, and a window that looked out over the city lights. Sarah could see signs of David's 3-week residence. Clothes draped over chairs, legal documents spread across the desk, empty room service trays stacked by the door. A framed photo of Sarah's high school graduation sat on the nightstand. The glass cracked as if it had been thrown and then carefully reassembled. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," David said, closing the door behind them. He moved slowly, as if every step required enormous effort. "Why wouldn't I want to see you? You're my dad." David's face crumpled at those words. He sank into one of the armchairs, burying his face in his hands. Am I? Am I still your dad, knowing what we know now?" Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. She moved across the room, her pregnancy making her awkward, and knelt beside his chair. "Of course you are. Biology doesn't change 23 years of love, doesn't it?" David looked up, and Sarah could see the devastation in his eyes. "For 23 years, I believed you were mine, my flesh and blood, my legacy, my little girl. Every milestone, every proud moment, every time I bragged about my brilliant daughter, it was all based on a lie." "No, it wasn't," Sarah said fiercely. "It was based on love. You chose to love me every single day. You chose to be proud of me, to support me, to be there for every game and every recital and every graduation. That wasn't a lie, Dad. That was real." But David was shaking his head. "I keep thinking about all the times Robert was there too. All those moments I thought he was just being a good uncle. And now I realize he was being a father. He was watching his daughter grow up, and I was just, what? The man who paid for everything? You were my father," Sarah insisted. "You are my father. The man who taught me to drive, who walked me down the aisle, who's going to be this baby's grandfather. Robert may have provided half my DNA, but you provided everything else." Michael cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Henderson, if I may." "Sarah's right. I've watched you two together for 5 years now. The bond you have isn't something that can be faked or built on obligation. You love each other. That's not going to change because of a piece of paper." David looked at Michael, then back at Sarah. "But how do I trust anything now? How do I trust that your mother ever loved me, knowing she was carrying another man's child? How do I trust that the last 23 years were real and not just an elaborate performance?" Sarah felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, and she pressed her hand to her belly, suddenly overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation she was bringing her child into. This baby would be David's grandchild in every way that mattered, but biologically, it would be Robert's grandchild. How did families navigate such complicated truths? "Dad," she said, the word coming out thick with emotion. I need you to know that finding out about Robert doesn't change how I feel about you. You raised me, you loved me, you made me who I am. That's not something biology can take away. David's eyes filled with fresh tears. I've been sitting in this room for 3 weeks trying to figure out how to feel. I'm angry at your mother, furious at Robert, confused about everything I thought I knew about my life. But when I think about you, he reached out tentatively and touched her face. When I think about you, all I feel is love, and that scares me because I don't know if I have the right to feel that way anymore. Of course you have the right, Sarah said, catching his hand and holding it against her cheek. You have every right. You're my dad. That's not going to change. They sat in silence for a moment, father and daughter grappling with the new reality that had been thrust upon them. Outside, Charlotte's evening traffic hummed steadily, and somewhere down the hall, a television played too loudly. What happens now? David asked finally. How do we move forward from this? Sarah shook her head. I don't know. I haven't spoken to Mom or Robert since this afternoon. I don't know if I can forgive them for lying to us for so long. I don't know how to build a relationship with Robert as my father when he's been my uncle my whole life. I don't know how to trust anything about my family anymore. But you still want me in your life? David's voice was small, uncertain in a way Sarah had never heard before. Dad, I need you in my life. This baby needs you. You're going to be a grandfather, and that's one of the few things about this situation that I'm absolutely certain about. David's face lit up for the first time since they'd arrived. A grandfather, he repeated, as if testing the words. I've been so caught up in feeling sorry for myself that I haven't really thought about that. Well, start thinking about it, Sarah said, managing a smile. Because in 2 months you're going to have a grandchild who needs you to be strong and present and ready to love unconditionally. Just like I loved you, David said quietly. Just like you loved me. Michael stood up from where he'd been sitting quietly on the bed. Mr. Henderson, Sarah and I were talking on the way over here about some practical considerations. She's going to need her family medical history updated with Robert's information for the baby's medical records. And we should probably consider some kind of family counseling to help everyone navigate this transition. David nodded. That makes sense. Though I have to be honest, I'm not ready to sit in a room with Robert and Patricia yet. Every time I think about them together, about what they did, his jaw clenched. I need more time before I can even attempt to be civil. Sarah understood. The betrayal ran deep, cutting through decades of trust and shared history. What about us, though? What about our relationship? Can we figure out how to move forward together, even while you're working through your feelings about them? I'd like that, David said, and for the first time since the revelation, his voice carried a note of hope. I'd like that very much. Maybe we could have dinner tomorrow, just the 3 of us. I'd love that, Dad. Sarah struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. David immediately stood to help her, his protective instincts unchanged by the afternoon's revelations. As they prepared to leave, David caught Sarah's hand. There's something else I need to say. About Robert. His voice was tight with controlled emotion. I hate what he did. I hate that he lied to me for 23 years, that he watched me raise his daughter and never said a word. But I also know that he loves you. I've seen it in the way he looked at you your whole life, though I never understood what I was seeing until now. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how to feel about him, Dad. He's been such an important part of my life. But knowing that he was really my father the whole time, that he was lying to me every single day, you don't have to figure it out right now, David said gently. Take your time. But when you're ready, maybe consider that he was trapped in an impossible situation too. He made terrible choices, but he was also trying to protect a family, our family, even if it meant sacrificing his own relationship with his daughter. The grace in David's words surprised Sarah. After everything he'd been through, everything he'd lost, he was still capable of seeing Robert's perspective. It reminded her why she'd always looked up to him, why his opinion mattered so much to her. I love you, Dad, she said, hugging him as tightly as her belly would allow. I love you too, sweetheart. More than biology, more than DNA, more than anything. The drive home was quiet, both Sarah and Michael lost in their own thoughts. When they pulled into their driveway, Sarah noticed that the lights were on in their living room and there was an unfamiliar car parked on the street. "Are you expecting someone?" Michael asked, noting her puzzled expression. "No." Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety. After the day they'd had, the last thing she wanted was to deal with unexpected visitors. They walked up their front path together, Michael's protective hand on the small of Sarah's back. Before they could reach the door, it opened, and Robert Henderson stepped out onto their front porch. He looked even more haggard than he had at the baby shower, if that was possible. His shirt was untucked, his hair disheveled, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. "Sarah, please," he said before either of them could speak. "I know you don't want to see me right now, but I couldn't leave things the way they were. I couldn't let you go to bed tonight thinking I don't care about how much I've hurt you." "Robert, this isn't a good time," Michael said firmly, moving slightly in front of Sarah. "She's had enough for one day." But Sarah put her hand on Michael's arm. As much as she wanted to retreat into her house and pretend none of this had happened, she knew that avoiding Robert wouldn't make the situation go away. And there were questions burning inside her that only he could answer. "It's okay," she said quietly. "We should talk." Michael looked like he wanted to argue, but he unlocked the front door and they all went inside. Sarah's house felt different somehow. Smaller, less safe than it had that morning. The comfortable familiarity of home had been tainted by the knowledge that nothing in her life was quite what she'd thought it was. They settled in the living room, Sarah and Michael on the couch, Robert in the armchair across from them. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Robert finally spoke. "I know there's nothing I can say that will make this right," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I know that 23 years of lies can't be undone with an apology. But I need you to understand why I did what I did." "I'm listening," Sarah said, though her voice was guarded. Robert ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Sarah realized she'd inherited from him. "When Patricia told me she was pregnant, we both agreed it was better for everyone if David believed the baby was his. He wanted children so badly, and Patricia was terrified that the truth would destroy their marriage. I thought I was doing the noble thing by stepping back." "But you didn't step back," Sarah pointed out. "You were always there, always involved in my life." "I tried to stay away," Robert said miserably. "For the first few months after you were born, I barely visited. I thought it would be easier for everyone if I just disappeared from your lives. But then Patricia called me one night when you were about 6 months old. You had a fever, and David was out of town, and she was terrified something was wrong. She asked me to come over and help." He paused, lost in the memory. "I held you that night while Patricia called the doctor. You were so small, so perfect, and you looked at me with those big brown eyes, my eyes, and I knew I couldn't walk away. I told myself I could love you as an uncle, that I could be part of your life without overstepping boundaries." "But it was torture, wasn't it?" Sarah asked, beginning to understand the impossible position he'd been in. "Watching Dad raise your daughter, never being able to claim me as yours." Robert's face crumpled. "Every single day. Every birthday party where I watched David blow out your candles with you. Every Christmas where you called him Daddy and looked at me as just Uncle Robert. Every milestone where I had to stand back and watch from the sidelines. It broke my heart a little more each time." Sarah felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for him. She tried to imagine what it would be like to watch someone else raise her child, to love from a distance for decades, to never be able to claim the relationship that mattered most to her. "But you still chose to lie," Michael said, his voice hard. "Every single day for 23 years, you chose to lie to Sarah and to David." "Yes," Robert admitted, "and I will regret that choice for the rest of my life. But at the time, it felt like the only option that would keep our family intact." "Oh, well, it didn't work," Sarah said bitterly. "Our family is anything but intact now." "I know." Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. "I know, and it's all my fault." The affair, the lies, the decision to finally tell the truth, all of it is my fault, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of the uncle who had been such a steady presence in her life, and the father she was only now learning to see. Why now? Why did you decide to tell the truth now when David found out about the DNA test? Because David gave me an ultimatum, Robert said. He told me I had 2 weeks to tell you the truth, or he would do it himself. And I realized that if the secret was going to come out anyway, I wanted it to come from me. I wanted to be the one to face the consequences of my choices. At my baby shower, Sarah said, still unable to believe the timing, you chose to destroy my family at a celebration of new life. Robert winced. I know how that must have looked. But I'd been carrying that envelope around for 3 weeks, trying to find the courage to tell you. When I walked into that room and saw you surrounded by all the people who love you, celebrating the new family you're creating with Michael, I suddenly realized that I couldn't let you build your life on the same foundation of lies that had defined mine. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd told her. The rational part of her brain could understand the impossible position he'd been in all those years ago. But the emotional part of her, the part that felt betrayed and confused and angry, wasn't ready to forgive him. I need time, she said finally. I need time to figure out how to feel about all of this. I need time to grieve the uncle I thought I had and figure out if there's room in my life for the father I never knew I needed. Robert nodded, tears streaming down his face. I understand, and I want you to know that whatever you decide about our relationship going forward, I will respect it. If you never want to see me again, I'll disappear from your life. If you want to build something new between us, I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust. He stood up, moving toward the door. But before I go, I need you to know one thing. Every single day of your life, I have been proud to be your father, even when I couldn't say it out loud. Watching you grow into the incredible woman you've become has been the greatest privilege of my life, even if I had to experience it from the sidelines. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. And Sarah, your baby is going to be so lucky to have you as a mother. You're going to love that child with the same fierce, unconditional love that David gave to you. The kind of love that doesn't depend on biology or DNA or anything else except the choice to love completely. After he left, Sarah and Michael sat in silence on their couch, both emotionally drained by the day's revelations. Outside, the October evening had turned cool, and Sarah could hear the wind rustling through the trees in their backyard. "How are you holding up?" Michael asked, pulling her closer to him. "I honestly don't know," Sarah admitted. "This morning I woke up as David Henderson's daughter, looking forward to a baby shower with my family. Tonight, I'm Robert Henderson's daughter, and I don't know what that means for any of us." Michael was quiet for a moment. "You know what I keep thinking about? What you said to David tonight about biology versus love. It's true, Sarah. The relationships we build, the love we choose to give and receive, that's what makes a family, not DNA." Sarah nodded, but she was thinking about their unborn child, who would grow up in the shadow of this family revelation. How would they explain to their son or daughter that Grandpa David wasn't actually related by blood, but that Uncle Robert, who was really Grandpa Robert, had been pretending to be someone else their whole lives? "Do you think we can get through this?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest all day. "I think you're the strongest person I know," Michael said, kissing the top of her head. "And I think this baby is going to be born into a family that might be complicated and messy and imperfect, but that loves fiercely and completely. That's more than a lot of people have." Sarah placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly beneath her skin. "I just want to do better than the generation before us. I want our child to grow up knowing the truth, even when it's complicated." "Then that's what we'll do," Michael said simply. "We'll tell the truth, even when it's hard. We'll love openly, even when it's messy. And we'll build the kind of family that our child can be proud of." As they sat together in the quiet of their living room, Sarah felt the first stirrings of hope since the world had exploded that afternoon. The family she'd known was gone, shattered by decades of deception and hidden truths. But maybe, from the wreckage, they could build something better, something based on honesty and choice rather than lies and obligation. It wouldn't be easy. There would be months, maybe years, of difficult conversations and hurt feelings and hard-won forgiveness. But for the first time since Robert had spoken those life-changing words at her baby shower, Sarah felt like the future might hold something other than just pain. 3 months later, Sarah Henderson Walsh stood in the nursery of her Charlotte home, folding tiny onesies and arranging them in the dresser drawers. The January afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming the pale yellow walls she and Michael had painted the weekend before. In 6 weeks, their baby would arrive, and despite everything that had happened since that devastating October afternoon, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten was possible: peace. The baby's room was a study, in careful neutrality. They'd chosen soft yellows and greens, with a border of dancing teddy bears that managed to be cheerful without being overwhelming. The crib, a gift from David, who had insisted on assembling it himself, sat beneath a mobile of hand-carved wooden animals that Robert had commissioned from a local craftsman. It was a physical representation of how their fractured family was slowly learning to coexist in the same space. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Michael asked from the indoor way. He'd taken to checking on her more frequently as her due date approached, protective instincts heightened by the emotional upheaval of the past few months. "Heavy," Sarah said with a laugh, pressing her hand to her lower back. "And nervous, and excited, and terrified, sometimes all at the same time." Michael crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands settling over hers on her enormous belly. The baby responded with a series of kicks that made them both laugh. "Someone's excited to meet us," he said, "or just running out of room in there." Sarah leaned back against her husband's chest, grateful for his steady presence. The past 3 months had tested their relationship in ways she'd never imagined, but Michael had been her anchor through every difficult conversation and tearful night. "Are you ready for tonight?" he asked gently. Tonight was the family dinner they'd been building toward for weeks, the first time since the baby shower that David, Patricia, and Robert would all be in the same room together. Dr. Martinez, the family therapist they'd been seeing, had suggested it as a way to practice being together before the baby arrived. Sarah wanted her child to be born into a family that was healing, not one that was permanently fractured. "As ready as I'll ever be," Sarah said, "though I still can't quite believe we're attempting this." The journey to this point had been anything but smooth. There had been weeks of individual therapy sessions, family sessions with different combinations of people, and long conversations that sometimes ended in tears and sometimes in tentative hope. Patricia and Robert had both thrown themselves into therapy with the desperate energy of people trying to save what remained of their family connections. David had been slower to commit to the process. For a month after the revelation, he'd remained at the hotel, seeing Sarah regularly but refusing to speak to Patricia or Robert. It was only when Sarah had ended up in the emergency room with pregnancy complications brought on by stress that David realized his withdrawal was causing additional harm to the daughter he loved. "She needs all of us," Dr. Martinez had told them during their first family session. "Not perfect people, not people without histories of mistakes and pain, but people who are committed to doing better. This baby is going to be born into a family with a complicated story, but that doesn't mean it has to be a broken family." Slowly, painfully, they'd begun to rebuild. David and Patricia were living separately but talking daily, working through 24 years of marriage that had been built on a fundamental deception. David had moved into a small apartment across town, but he came for dinner twice a week and had never missed one of Sarah's doctor's appointments. The relationship between David and Robert remained the most fragile. There had been one explosive confrontation during a therapy session where David had finally released 23 years of suppressed anger, and Robert had absorbed it without defending himself. After that, they'd found a way to be civil, even occasionally collaborative when it came to Sarah and the baby. "I keep thinking about what Dr. Martinez said last week," Sarah said, turning in Michael's arms to face him, "about how the baby won't know that our family is complicated unless we teach them to see it that way." "She's right," Michael agreed. "To your baby, it will just be normal to have Grandpa David, who raised Mommy, and Grandpa Robert, who's Mommy's biological father, and Grandma Patricia, who loves everyone fiercely and makes the best chocolate chip cookies in North Carolina." Sarah smiled at that. Patricia had been channeling her guilt and grief into elaborate cooking projects, showing up at Sarah's house every few days with meals for the freezer and baked goods that appeared whenever anyone looked hungry. It was her way of trying to nurture the family back together, one home-cooked meal at a time. The doorbell rang, interrupting their quiet moment. Sarah checked the clock on the nursery wall. It was only 4 o'clock, but Patricia had said she'd come early to help with dinner preparations. Cooking together had become one of the few activities that felt normal between them, a way to connect without having to navigate the minefield of their altered relationship. "I'll get it," Michael said, but Sarah was already heading for the stairs. "I need the exercise anyway. Dr. Patterson says walking will help with labor when the time comes." But when Sarah opened the front door, it wasn't Patricia standing on her porch. It was her father. Both of her fathers, actually. David and Robert stood side by side, neither looking entirely comfortable with the arrangement, but both carrying grocery bags and wearing expressions of determined civility. "We came together," David announced, as if this was a normal occurrence rather than the first time they'd voluntarily spent time in each other's company since the revelation. "Dr. Martinez thought it might be good practice," Robert added, "for us to do something together that focuses on you and the baby rather than our own issues." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The pregnancy hormones made her emotional about everything these days, but this gesture meant more to her than either man probably realized. "Come in," she said, stepping back to let them into her house. They moved past her with careful choreography, David heading automatically for the kitchen, where he'd been helping with dinner preparations for years, Robert following more hesitantly. Sarah watched them navigate the space around each other. Not friends, probably. Never friends, but two men who loved the same woman enough to figure out how to coexist. "What's the plan for dinner?" David asked, unpacking groceries with the easy familiarity of someone who knew where everything belonged in Sarah's kitchen. "Mum's making her famous lasagna," Sarah said. "I'm handling the salad and bread. Michael's in charge of wine for everyone else and sparkling cider for me." "I brought dessert," Robert said, pulling a bakery box from one of his bags. "That chocolate cake from the place downtown that you used to love when you were little." It was such a small thing, but it demonstrated something Sarah was still getting used to. Robert's intimate knowledge of her preferences and history. Information he'd gathered during 23 years of watching her from the sidelines. He knew she loved chocolate cake from Amelie's French bakery, knew she preferred vanilla ice cream to chocolate, knew she'd always requested that specific cake for special occasions. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "That's perfect." Patricia arrived 20 minutes later with the lasagna and enough nervous energy to power the entire neighborhood. She bustled around the kitchen, checking and rechecking the temperature of the oven, rearranging the table settings twice, and generally keeping herself busy enough to avoid having to make eye contact with Robert for more than a few seconds at a time. The relationship between Patricia and Robert remained the most strained of all the family connections. They'd had their own series of therapy sessions, working through the guilt and regret and complicated emotions that came with their shared secret finally being exposed. But forgiveness was a process, not an event, and they were still in the early stages of figuring out how to relate to each other as extended family rather than co-conspirators. "Sarah, honey, should I put the bread in the oven now?" Patricia asked, her voice slightly too bright. "In about 10 minutes, Mom. It'll be perfect timing." Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, surveying the scene with the bemused expression he'd developed over the past few months. "Can I help with anything? Or am I just going to stay out of the way of the Henderson family cooking brigade?" "You can set up the drinks," Sarah said, "and maybe put on some music, something cheerful, but not too loud." As her family moved around the kitchen, each person focused on their assigned tasks, Sarah felt a moment of profound gratitude. This wasn't the family dinner she'd imagined having when she was pregnant. It wasn't the simple, uncomplicated gathering she'd grown up with. But it was real, and it was honest, and it was theirs. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her belly. "You okay?" David was beside her instantly, his protective instincts unchanged by the complexities of their altered relationship. "Fine," Sarah assured him. "Just active. I think all the excitement is making the baby restless." Or maybe they're excited to meet everyone," Patricia said, her face lighting up with the joy that always appeared when she talked about her coming grandchild. "Have you two finalized the name yet?" Robert asked. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to the group rather than just to Sarah, and everyone noticed. Sarah and Michael exchanged a look. They'd been having the same conversation about names for months, unable to settle on anything that felt exactly right. "We have it narrowed down to a few options," Michael said diplomatically, "but we're planning to wait and see what feels right when we meet the baby." "Smart choice," David said. "You were supposed to be named Elizabeth, but when you were born, your mom took one look at you and said, 'This is definitely a Sarah.'" Patricia smiled at the memory. "You had this serious little expression, like you were already planning how to organize the world around you." Elizabeth felt too formal for such a determined little person. It was the kind of family story Sarah had grown up with, the kind of shared memory that created the foundation of identity and belonging. But now, she found herself wondering which details were true and which had been edited to maintain the fiction of David's paternity. "Were you there when I was born?" she asked Robert quietly. Robert's face went through a series of emotions: pain, longing, regret. "I was in the waiting room," he said finally. "David was in the delivery room with your mother, of course. But I needed to be there. I told everyone I was just being a supportive brother-in-law. And I never questioned it," David added, his voice carefully neutral. "I thought it was just Robert being Robert, always there for family." The moment could have been awkward, but instead it felt like progress. They were learning to talk about the complicated truth of Sarah's early life without it derailing into accusations and hurt feelings. "Dinner's ready," Patricia announced, and they moved to the dining room with the careful orchestration of people still learning how to be together. The dining room table was set with Sarah's wedding china and the good silverware that usually only came out for holidays. Patricia had lit candles, and the warm light made everything feel intimate and special. As they settled into their seats, Michael and Sarah on one side, David and Patricia on the other, Robert at the head of the table, Sarah felt like they looked almost like a normal family. "Should we say grace?" Patricia asked, then immediately looked uncertain. "I mean, if everyone's comfortable with that." They'd been a family that said grace at holiday meals, but not necessarily at regular dinners. But tonight felt like it deserved some kind of acknowledgement, some recognition of the effort they were all making to be present and civil and hopeful. "I'd like that," Sarah said. They joined hands around the table, David reaching for Patricia's hand with only a moment's hesitation, Robert taking Sarah's hand like it was made of spun glass, Michael bridging the connection between Sarah and Patricia with his steady presence. "Dear God," Patricia began, her voice soft but clear, "thank you for bringing us together tonight. Thank you for the love that binds us together, even when things are complicated and difficult. Thank you for this baby who's coming soon, and for the chance to be a family, maybe not the family we expected, but the family we're choosing to become. Help us to love each other well, and to forgive each other's mistakes, and to build something beautiful from the pieces of what we thought we knew." "Amen, amen," they echoed around the table. As they began to pass the lasagna and salad and bread, conversation flowed more easily than Sarah had expected. They talked about practical things, baby preparations, work projects, the unusually warm January weather. David and Robert discovered they both had opinions about the Charlotte Hornets' chances in the playoffs. Patricia fussed over making sure everyone had enough to eat. Michael regaled them with stories from his law firm's holiday party. It felt almost normal, and Sarah realized that maybe that was enough for now. Maybe they didn't need to solve all their complicated emotions and painful history in one evening. Maybe they just needed to practice being in the same room together, sharing a meal, acting like people who cared about each other. "I have something I want to say," David announced as Patricia was serving the chocolate cake. "I've been thinking about this a lot, and I want everyone to hear it." The table went quiet, forks suspended halfway to mouths. "I want to thank Robert," David continued, his voice steady but emotional. "I've been angry for months about the lies and the deception, and I'm not saying I'm completely over that. But I realized something recently. For 23 years, Robert could have demanded to be part of Sarah's life as her father. He could have insisted on his rights, or threatened to tell the truth, or made our lives miserable. Instead, he stepped back and let me be her dad." Robert's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't speak. "I got to raise one of the most incredible human beings I've ever known," David continued, looking directly at Sarah. "I got to be there for every scraped knee and bad dream and proud moment. I got to walk her down the aisle and see her become the amazing woman she is today. Robert gave me that gift, even though it cost him everything he wanted." The silence around the table was profound. "I'm not saying I forgive everything," David said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm not saying the lies were right, but I am saying thank you for letting me be her father when you had every biological right to claim that role for yourself." Robert wiped his eyes with his napkin. "You were always the better father, David. I just contributed some DNA. You contributed a lifetime of love. And now this baby gets to have both of you as grandfathers," Sarah said, her own voice thick with emotion. "Gets to be loved by two men who are both good and decent and caring, even when they make mistakes." Patricia reached for Sarah's hand across the table. "This baby is going to be so lucky, so incredibly loved." As if responding to all the emotion around the table, the baby began to move actively in Sarah's belly. She pressed her hand to the spot where tiny feet were pushing against her ribs. "Someone's awake," she said with a laugh. "Can we feel?" Patricia asked hopefully. Sarah nodded, and suddenly everyone was gathered around her chair, hands on her belly, waiting to feel their grandchild move. When the baby kicked hard enough for everyone to feel, the exclamations of delight filled the dining room. "Strong kicks," Robert observed, wonder in his voice. "This one's going to be a fighter, just like their mama," David said, squeezing Sarah's shoulder. In that moment, with her complicated, imperfect, beautiful family surrounding her and her unborn child, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since that October afternoon. Complete happiness. Not the simple, uncomplicated happiness of her old life, but something deeper and more resilient, the happiness that comes from choosing love over resentment, truth over comfort, hope over fear. 6 weeks later, Elizabeth Grace Henderson Walsh was born on a snowy February morning, weighing 7 pounds, 3 ounces, and arriving with the same serious expression that had inspired her name. David was the first to hold her after her parents, and when he looked down into her tiny face, he whispered, "Hello, granddaughter. You're going to be so loved." Robert held her next, tears streaming down his face as he studied her features, his chin, Sarah's nose, Michael's dark hair. "Thank you," he whispered to Sarah. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." Patricia couldn't stop taking pictures, documenting every moment of Elizabeth's first day with her family. "She's perfect," she kept saying. "Absolutely perfect." And she was. Elizabeth Grace was perfect in the way that all babies are perfect. Not because she was without flaws or challenges ahead, but because she was exactly who she was supposed to be, born into exactly the family she was meant to have. As Sarah lay in her hospital bed that evening, holding her daughter while her husband dozed in the chair beside them and her extended family had finally gone home to rest, she thought about the family story Elizabeth would grow up hearing. It would be a complicated story, full of mistakes and forgiveness and the messy reality of human imperfection. But it would also be a story about love prevailing over betrayal, about people choosing to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their own making. Elizabeth would grow up knowing that families aren't just about biology. They're about the daily choice to love and support and forgive each other. She would know that Grandpa David had raised Mommy with fierce devotion, even though they didn't share DNA. She would know that Grandpa Robert had loved Mommy from a distance for 23 years before finally being able to claim his relationship with her. She would know that Grandma Patricia had made terrible mistakes, but had spent every day since trying to make amends. Most importantly, Elizabeth would grow up in a family that had learned to tell the truth, even when it was hard. She would never have to wonder about her identity or heritage, never have to discover devastating secrets that rewrote her understanding of herself. The snow continued to fall outside the hospital window, blanketing Charlotte in pristine white. Inside the warm room, 3 generations of Henderson women slept peacefully. Patricia in the reclining chair she'd refused to leave, Sarah in her hospital bed, and Elizabeth in her bassinet, all 3 breathing in the synchronized rhythm of family. When visiting hours started the next morning, David and Robert arrived together again, carrying coffee and flowers and the eager anticipation of grandparents ready to spoil their granddaughter. They'd driven together, Sarah learned later, talking the entire way about their hopes for Elizabeth's future and their determination to be the kind of grandfathers she could be proud of. It wasn't the family story Sarah had expected to write, but as she watched her daughter sleep in David's arms, while Robert pointed out her tiny fingernails, and Patricia planned the nursery rhymes she would teach her, Sarah realized it was exactly the family story they needed. Love, it turned out, was more resilient than lies, stronger than DNA, and more powerful than the mistakes that had once threatened to destroy them all. And Elizabeth Grace Henderson Walsh would grow up knowing that love, in all its complicated and imperfect forms, was the foundation upon which families were truly built.